I think at the more province-wide and national level, there is that discussion. But at the community level, you know, a lot of the community people are trying to get attention from the government, and they develop their own tactics and strategy. For instance, KI, one of the communities in northern Ontario, they're about 600 miles north of Thunder Bay. They're the community where the chief and council stopped Platinum Mines from developing a mine in their area. Actually, Chief Donnie Morris and his council were actually sentenced to 6 months in jail. And they actually served a little over 72 days, and they were let out by the Ontario Court of Appeal. And after that, about a year later, last August, the Platinum went back up there to try to develop the mine again, and then Chief Donnie Morris took his little motorboat and went underneath the float plane and didn't allow it to land. So the court was called back in, and they either had a choice of throwing him back in jail, or the Ontario government had to intervene, which they did, and they actually bought out Platinum for $5 million, and they took the mine right out of the Mining Act. It can't be claimed ever again. But
all right, so that's a pretty serious victory.
Yeah, it's a very serious victory. But one of the things that they didn't want at their demonstration were even people that swore. Because they didn't believe in people swearing and getting that upset. So, you know, like, I mean, like...
So the next big anti-capitalist convergence, no swearing.
No swearing.
Okay? That's gonna fly. That's gonna fly. That'll really fly out.
And the chief said that very bluntly, you know. But they won, you know, so... But the thing is that that's the direction that I take, is from the community level.
I think that... a sort of undertone that I want to just bring to the surface is some of these new alliances that have been emerging in the last year in Canada, and the potential that they have going forward. I've been spending more time, and Naomi has been spending more time doing research and journalism on climate issues, and I just think that this moment that we're in right now can't pass without an examination of its potential. I mean, here we are with the hottest summer on record ever in this province, where the noonday sun has turned into a sunset because of the smoke from raging fires. And we no longer have the luxury of saying that the climate crisis is being experienced by people on the other side of the planet, or that it's something for our grandchildren or our children. It's happening now. We're feeling it now in major cities in Canada, and we are one of the places in the world which is most protected geographically, and yet we can no longer deny what's in front of us. There's a lot of tremendous climate activism going on. And as Naomi said earlier, some of the biggest sites of resistance, like the tar sands in Alberta, and many cases in Latin America and Africa and Asia, are indigenous-led struggles where environmental movements and other movements that haven't traditionally been associated with environmental issues are starting to converge around the greatest threat to life on our planet. And I'm interested in what you guys think are the potential of these emerging alliances, and where there's friction that needs to be worked on.
Yeah, I think definitely, you know, in the tar sands, I know George Putras and the IEN, the Indigenous Environmental Network, Clayton Thomas Mueller, and then they've been working very hard to develop a strategy that would stop the tar sands. But it's going to have to be an international initiative, because you're basically challenging the whole petroleum culture that we have become very accustomed to living in. And people are going to have to question that. And then the indigenous people I know, like Mike Mercurdy from up in that area, he used to drive truck for Syncrude up in the tar sands, and you know, when he started finding out that the consequences of some of the work that he was doing in terms of driving these huge trucks was causing his own family, cancer, and these very rare kind of cancer, and people were dying, he had to make a decision to quit working for them. And he had to take a serious cutback in terms of his income and his work. And I think, those are the kinds of situations that I think people have to start thinking about, Economies is not just this top-down sort of hierarchical type of profit motive type of relationship with the land. Because a lot of people in the indigenous community understand that the damage that you cause to the land will come back, and it will actually not necessarily harm you, but may harm your children or your great-grandchildren or your people in the future.
Naomi, we've been to Louisiana in the aftermath of the BP disaster. You've been writing about climate debt, the question of what is owed from the countries that have created the crisis to the countries that are feeling the worst effects, and the peoples within countries who benefit from the exploitation of fossil fuels and the destruction of our climate, and the people who pay for it. What do you see as the potentials here for sites of resistance? Sometimes I think that the pipelines going south from Canada to the U.S. to take the bitumen for processing, because of course we have no processing in Canada. The leak in Michigan, the pipeline leak, was oil that had been brought from the tar sands to the Midwest for processing and was being shipped back up to Ontario when it spilled. Sometimes I think the pipelines might almost be a map of where sites of resistance might be, and where new constituencies can connect. People in the Midwest of the United States have never seen common cause with Indigenous people in the Athabasca region, but now they're at the receiving end of some of the very same infrastructure. And I think we're starting to see some of this. Where do you see this going?
We are at an environmental tipping point. And we are within a system that is insane, and that can only
Three cheers for insanity.
We're locked within an economic and cultural and political system that doesn't know how to stop, that is incapable of stopping, that only understands momentum and growth. And so even as we absorb all of this information about ecological limits and ecological boundaries, we seem to lack the ability or the tools to take the next step and to actually act on this information and on these conclusions in a sane way. So rather than reining in our consumption at this tipping point moment for the climate and for biodiversity and just for the actual resources in the earth, we have entered into a phase that I think is best understood as a final colonial pillage, where we are ravaging the edges of our continents for the hardest to reach resources, because that's all that's left. We've taken everything else, and now we're going for the really, really hard to get stuff, like the tar sands, like the oil 5,000 feet down. And it is insanity. It's insanity as we extract it, and it's insanity when the fuel is burned, when the coal is burned. So this is the moment that we're living in, and we have to stop this. And we have to understand it as a pillage, as a frantic pillage. And this is, it's a challenge geographically because so much of it is happening in remote places, right? I mean, it's a challenge logistically for us to organize. And that's, this is art is very involved in organizing in remote communities that have, in many ways, successfully resisted this type of development precisely because they are remote. And it's expensive to extract in remote communities, but the price of these resources have gotten so high that it's actually worth it now to go after the hardest to get stuff, right? I think there is a lesson, a really clear lesson that we must learn from the BP disaster. I mean, I feel terrified right now that somehow that lesson is being lost and people are allowing themselves to go back to sleep with this idea that, oh, it wasn't so bad, and Mother Nature is cleaning up after the boys, right? And the oil is somehow magically disappearing, and all of those dispersants are apparently magically disappearing. We have to learn from what we saw along the Gulf Coast, because it has direct relevance to what's happening with the tar sands. It is the incredible hubris of thinking that we can dominate nature to such an extent that there would be no risk involved. And it's the same rhetoric that we hear out of the tar sands. Oh, there's no pollution in Fort Chip. People aren't dying of cancer there. It's the same stuff that we heard in Louisiana when we were down there reporting. So we have to somehow learn that lesson, learn the lesson of the spill in Michigan, which brings it home and says, this isn't just something, you can't just blame this on BP, this isn't just about the United States, this is Canadian oil as well. And the tar sands are just an environmental disaster all the time. There doesn't need to be a spill for it to be a disaster. It's 24/7 disaster, right? As sick as it is to say, I wrote in my piece for the Guardian, I say, they say that Americans learn about geography by bombing places, right? And now it seems that we're learning about natural ecological systems by poisoning them. We're like, oh really, there's a loop current? Follow the oil. Turns out there is, right? In some weird, twisted way, the pipelines are also an opportunity to bring us together if we can keep them from being built. I think in so many ways the resistance to the types of projects that Art has talked about, they have been neglected by what should really be not just a national movement but an international movement. And we need to network and see the commonalities between all of these sites of extraction and sites of resistance. And I think in many ways this network of pipelines is doing our work for us by creating those geographical connections and allowing us to make these connections across geography, across community, across culture, and we have to. And I feel like it is a privilege to live in a time of such consequence when we can make such a difference. And I think it is especially a privilege to live in British Columbia, which is 95% unceded Indigenous land. That is a privilege, because what that means, and this is what Art is always trying to educate us about, is that there are tools in our hands in this province to get actual pieces of geography out of this mad machine, right? If we're willing to use them. And not everybody in the world can say that, have as many legal precedents, have as many constitutional precedents to actually, and the question is, do we have the courage, do we have the guts, do we have the stamina to actually use them to take pieces of this earth out of that system and create sane models? That's the future. When we talk about defenders of the land, that is the defense. It's the only defense. So, we have a choice about whether to be terrified about living in this historical moment or whether to be inspired by living in this historical moment. And I think that this place can be a model, really, for the world, because of the incredible privilege that is born of the tenacity and courage and dignity of Indigenous people in this province who have not given up their land. Thank God.
We're out of time. Thank you. Take that with you. Thanks, Art.
Thank you.